Welcome to the Convergence Podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Sivanand.
Is this making me more productive? Is this enabling me to move faster? Am I going to save money? And that's really like the core thing about developer experience. That it's like show, don't tell, and you really lead with the value and the product experience.
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Welcome back, folks. On this episode, I get to hear from Kenneth Auchenberg, and we get to nerd out about a topic that I am really passionate about, developer experiences. If your product or part of your product is consumed by engineers at your customers, whether it's through an API, an SDK, or other building blocks, it's really important to empathize with those customer developers using techniques like human-centered design, and then being really intentional about your experimentation and how you prioritize those features that delight those customers in your roadmaps. So on this conversation with Kenneth, I get to hear a lot about his experience working on developer favorite tools I know that developers love, like VS Code at Microsoft and Stripe. Kenneth's also a very active investor in this space and advises a ton of companies on platforms and developer experience. We get to hear about things like the differences between infrastructure companies and platform companies, the difference between developer experience and developer relations, and some of the really important principles that go into designing and delivering really delightful developer experiences. We love this so much that we split the episode up into two. You are listening to the second of two episodes. On the first one, make sure to go back and check it out. We got to hear about Kenneth's experience working at companies like Stripe and Microsoft and other developer-centric platform products, and some of his insights that come from working at those real powerhouses. On this episode today, we'll get to go a little bit deeper and hear about the advanced techniques that Kenneth applies into designing and delivering really great developer experiences, like the use of abstraction ladders and how a really strong developer experience is needed, in addition to a developer relations team to drive adoption and retention of your API and SDK-based products. We also get to talk a little bit about what Kenneth thinks the future of platforms will be, especially with the further proliferation of AI and generative AI into our product development and into our products. One of the phrases that we use a lot in both of these segments is platform primitives, and we don't get to define it till a little bit later. So I'll help you out a little bit there. Platform primitives are really the building blocks, some of the really low-level but highly reusable Lego bricks, if you will, on things like maybe authentication and authorization or data storage and retrieval that provide a lot of the essential services for your platform that your developers or your customer developers can build more complex and sophisticated products and applications on top of. That is one of the many things that I got to nerd out with Kenneth about on this episode. I learned way more about designing, defining, prioritizing really delightful developer experiences. And if you're a product manager doing the same, or an engineer or a designer that's working towards building a really delightful set of tools for your customer developers, I am sure you will learn a lot too. Let me know what you think in the comments. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. So, let's maybe also stay at the fundamentals a little bit, and then we build from there. Talking about developer experience or DevEx. Tell us, what's the difference between DevEx and DevRel for you?
Yeah, I have a little spicy Twitter thread I've done a few years ago that outlines my point of view here. I think, to me, developer experience is all about the product experience you're providing for developers, and I see a lot of conflation between like doing developer relations and developer marketing and community building, and conflating that with developer experience. I think those things go hand in hand, and I think doing 2021 SERP, we definitely saw a trend that all developer relations teams around the world, they suddenly got renamed to be the developer experience teams. But to me, a great developer experience really starts with the product experience. And then you kind of like have radiating circles from that. So like you lead with the product value and what you're building. You can talk about that value in your community, etc. You could do events around it, etc. So that's really like a way to say that in any kind of modern developer experience organization or team that is focused on developer experience, you have more outbound focus roles that are focused on the community marketing, etc. And you also have internally faced roles focused on actually building the product experience. And I think a modern kind of like developer experience team is a combination of both.
Very cool. And what are some of the companies that if I was a founder or CPO, CTO thinking, hey, I want to go get really good at this, maybe I'll start with some examples of which API should I go get a key for and try and onboard myself to feel it myself.
Yeah, like I'm naturally biased in some of the work I've been doing in the past. So naturally, I would recommend Stripe. I still think Stripe has one of like the industry leading developer experiences with some of the work that myself and my teams has been doing. But I also think that there's other companies now that are coming around in terms of like there's Work OS. Michael, the founder and CEO, is a great guy, really passionate about developer experience. He's building authentication. There's recent.com that is doing email infrastructure. I think that there's a lot of companies really like leading the next generation of what great developer experience is like. I should say that there's still like all these companies kind of look the same in terms of like they provide an API, have great documentation, etc. But really what it comes down to is like what is that kind of core product experience? And are you providing infrastructure and services to enable others to be building with it? And those examples I just mentioned, they're like great infrastructure companies. I wouldn't call them platform companies, but they're really providing a very opinionated infrastructure with a very tasteful and crafted experience on top.
If your customers are developers, whether you're in infrastructure or you're in platform, DevEx, DevRel, definitely high priorities, right?
Yeah, like 100%. Like developer experience is nothing like revolutionary. It's literally like it's the UX of what you provide to developers, right? Similar to like if you were like doing B2B software, B2B or B2C software, you want to make sure that you have a surprisingly great user experience, a really crafted experience, great onboarding, etc. Developer experience is applying a lot of the same user experience principles to what it means to be building with what you're providing to developers. And that can be everything from like SDKs, high level abstractions to core APIs, to programming languages and compilers. It's really about like you being intentional about the experience you're providing to developers. And developer experience is somewhat a niche discipline because there's not that many companies that are truly great at it, but it's also incredibly important when you work with an audience like developers. So I would say the developer customer segment is probably one of the most discerning segments you can work with. Is that developers have a very, very high bar for I would say like have a high, really like well calibrated bullshit filter. Is that for them it's yeah. Really about like, is this making me more productive? Is this enabling me to move faster? Am I going to save money? I don't have time to listen to like a big marketing spiel, etc. Like show me the value. And that's really like the core thing about developer experience is that it's like show, don't tell. And you really lead with the value and the product experience.
You mentioned abstraction in there. And I think when you think about going back to what you were talking about, really being intentional about the product, abstraction and that common language is something you want to be intentional around, where your customer developers and your own developers are thinking about the same way. And I know you've got this concept around abstraction ladders that maybe helps with that. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, like we think about like, first of all, what is an abstraction and what are you providing to, like, generally what you do is that you're trying to abstract away complexity. You're trying to make something like simpler to use by providing a neater abstraction and a neater packaging around it. And I really think like some of the greatest platforms in the world have this really great concept of abstraction ladders. is that you can go from one level of abstraction to another. You can always have like slight visibility in terms of understanding what is happening behind the surface, but it's also a matter of like abstraction ladders is really about like power versus complexity. We think about this as a diagram, is that as you kind of go up in the abstraction ladder, you kind of get further away from like the lower levels. But it's really about like enabling you to either be more powerful, that means you go down the ladder, or like you kind of shield away more complexity. So it's kind of like this nice relationship of like, usually you want, when you start consuming a platform, you want to be very high level. You want to like do a very specific task, but you can kind of like take another layer of the onion and you go down and you reveal more complex, like you expose more complexity, but you reveal more power. And you can continue to go down that abstraction ladder. And suddenly you are down at like the very low level where you have a lot of power, but it's also very, 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 very complicated and complex to use. So there's definitely like a lot of art in designing those experiences and designing those abstraction ladders. And platform builders are spending years agonizing over the right details and think about those relationships.
If you could maybe give us an example, maybe from Stripe or somewhere else that our folks can relate to a little bit around what are some things on the different layers of that ladder and how that power and complexity kind of interact.
Yeah, like a high level kind of concept would be that, think about a company that is providing a authentication page. They have like a few different flavors of enabling you to do authentication and having a nice login screen where you can sign in with Google. There one flavor that is, we're going to do all the hosted page for you. All we're going to give you is a link. You can give that to your customers and they can log in. The next kind of offering they have is like, we give you like a UI library that you can embed inside your own website. And the next abstraction might be, we give you like a low level JavaScript library that you can call and build kind of your own UI. And the next abstraction would be like, we give you just an API you can call with curl, and then you can log in users. Those are like essentially the same experience. We're providing a way users can log in, but there's different abstractions into like the complexity that's being hidden away from the developer. It's ultimately the same experience for the end user, but each option has different kind of a combination of power and complexity. Is that the low level API that is provided to the developer has a lot of power, but also like it means that the developer have to absorb a lot of that complexity themselves and build a lot of the experience. And some of like the best platforms that have multiple flavors of such a product offering are actually enabling a linear path through those experiences. So that means if you go back to this hosted page, the hosted page is actually using the UI components. The UI components is actually using the SDK. The SDK is actually calling the same API. And there's kind of like a red thread and a line through the different abstraction ladders. And they're all kind of dog fooding each other and enabling a very positive feedback loop that the developer always have. I would say like some of the best platforms in the world enabling that careful reveal over time, but they also enable a user to kind of press the eject button, that they can always go one level further down that abstraction ladder. So let's say if you're going for the hosted page, you can press the button and you get the UI components. Oh, you want to do your own UI components, you press the button, you get the SDK. You don't like the SDK, great, you get the raw API request. Really managing that line. And I also think the same, you can kind of go all the way down when we think about programming, is that I can go from one programming language, I can go to bytecode, I can go to assembly, etc.
There's a level of maturity that exists in each of those, like either the products or maybe the businesses behind the products, where if I'm a startup and I've got very little funding and I don't have a lot of brand identity already, then that first example you gave me is probably good enough because I just need the user to be able to log in.
Right. Yeah.
And I can't afford to spend a lot more time building this thing from like further down. And I just need users to log in so they can do the core value inside. Compared to if you're a more mature company or a more mature product, then maybe it's warranted and you've got a little bit more momentum behind you to go through the additional complexity. And is that how you think about sort of the customer use case and their maturity or the problem they're trying to solve when it comes to
Yeah,
figuring
like
out where you draw the lines?
I did you think about like what is the business value you're bringing to the table in terms of like you building infrastructure is essentially going to a customer and saying, would you like to outsource this business problem or this aspect of your solution to us, and we can lift that job, right? And I think the opportunity for any kind of infrastructure company is to go out there and lift as much of that responsibility and take that away from your plate and saying, oh, you don't want to do taxes, you don't want to do this, don't want to do compute, just call us instead. And like you kind of developing your product offering is exactly to identify those maturity point and the boundaries of where do you have an opportunity to outsource functionality and accrue a lot of value, but also you to kind of assert leverage, right? But I think some of the most well-architected platforms are very intentional about what that curve is like. And it's very easy when you go out and build something saying, tomorrow I want to build a new kind of authentications. And let's just stay with that scenario. Is that it's very easy to go out and we just build that hosted page. And then next time another enterprise customer will say, you know what, I really like to be able to customize it. So great, now we go and build the SDK. I was like, oh, I really want more control. I want to pay you a lot of money for that control. So can you just give me the raw API? And then you go build the API. And then 3 years has gone by, and then you have 3 different systems that you maintain because none of them are dogfooding each other. So I think that's kind of like the journey of like you being disciplined and principled about how you architect your products, but also how you're enabling that careful reveal throughout the product offering that you're building. And some of the best platforms, and I would say like infrastructure companies, are getting this right from day one because they have a strong point of view and saying, I know that I have to start with this very high leverage hosted offering, but the way I've been building it is that I can enable that careful reveal over time. So I think it's very easy to kind of cut corners here. And so how you think about these things, but you can definitely set yourself up for success by having that long-term plan of like, where do you actually want to go with the infrastructure you are providing?
Absolutely. And I think the dog fooding part is also a great, what I call maybe a North Star when it comes to prioritizing technical debt as well, right? Because we're going to end up in those situations where we want to get something out fast because it'll close a big enterprise client or get a next round of funding or something. There's always good reasons to skip some steps. And if you're not using your own components to build your more complete systems, then it's just going to be more confusing for the developers and lead to the other risks that you just pointed out. So from a prioritization lens, it seems like a great thing to consider. Have you experienced that or any stories that come to mind?
Yeah, like I definitely see like it's very easy to kind of cut corners here, but I just wanted to tie a bow to really like the ecosystem and the platform building aspect is that if you apply like a platform first kind of mindset and apply the principles about what it means to be building a platform and enabling like essentially a third party ecosystem to consume your abstraction, be building with them, is that it like you having internal teams building with your own platform primitives and building higher order products on top of you, you are essentially facilitating an ecosystem. That ecosystem just happens to be staffed by your colleagues. But that really means that what you're really building is a platform and an ecosystem. You're nurturing and bootstrapping that internal ecosystem first. And eventually one day, maybe you want to expose that to the world and have third party developers that are outside of your company actually leverage the exact same primitives that you've been building, enabling them to be building for your customers. So I think that there's a lot of synergies here is that some of the most well-used or like well-architected platforms of the world are actually both used internally and externally. They're using the exact same platform primitives. And a very like common failure mode is that you have now reached the point where you have your multi-product portfolio. There's a new exec coming in and it's like, I want to be a platform. I want to enable the compounding value. I want the ecosystem. I want all this. And then the product teams go out and build this bolt-on solution that's kind of bolted on to the main product. It's usually like developers.company.com that is only for external developers. And meanwhile, all the internal people are building new products, new experiences using the internal tools, the internal APIs, and then the third-party developers out there, they're left with like the scraps of these public APIs that is not really used internally. They don't, to your point, don't have great feedback loops. There's no developers really using them. It's just for like these like a few hundred developers out there, and you end up in this like really unfortunate feedback loop where the external developers, they're not stupid. They know that this is the third party solution. They can see the 1P, the internal product moving faster than the third party tools. And then you end up in this very unfortunate feedback loop, both from a maintenance perspective, but also from an ecosystem perspective. So I think that's an element of like, if you truly want to be a platform enabling that trust and enabling that true leverage that the ecosystem gives you, is really about like thinking about the platform primitives that you are providing, and find ways that you can take the same primitives that you're providing internally to also provide them those externally.
Depending on the type of the organization, is easier said than done.
Oh, right? For sure. Yeah.
There's like a discipline that you mentioned there where, like as a consumer, certainly there's a moment of delight, at least curiosity, when you look at an API and you say, oh, I'm surprised they give me access to this. And it's
right, yeah.
just develops like a strong sense of loyalty towards this company, because it really proves that, hey, there's trust in our partners and our ecosystem. And what you talked about there is easier said than done, especially in companies that are transitioning towards tech companies that didn't grow up as tech companies and maybe don't have the same sort of culture or systems. So what are some things that, you can think of that really drives a forcing function amongst the teams where it's driving that adoption of internal usage, that you get internal validation around it versus having a separate bucket of APIs for your customers?
Yeah, like stepping back, like, and really tying it back to like how I think about platforms. Like if platform is really about like giving up control and asserting leverage in intentional and strategic ways, right? So I think like it really starts by the change management aspect. And to your point, that's much more than just the product and the technology here. It's really about change management, about like creating a culture and a mindset of saying, we are building these primitives and we're intentionally giving up control on how like the Lego blocks are being put together, because we want to enable like the messy experimentation and the compounding effects of people building and experimenting on top of us, right? So I think like it really comes down to like the element of change management and like you working with your organization and your peers and your fellow PMs. It's like, why are we doing this? What are some of the effects we want to get out of this? And a way I kind of been talking about this is that normally we talk about platforms and then we talk about Lego bricks. Those are the primitives. And then like we talk about like the products we are building with our platform. But usually we talk about, we have our products and then we have the platform on the side. But really like to enable that like composition of having the same primitives, the same Lego bricks, enabling you to have both internal products and external products built with the same things, is really about like you thinking about the products you're building as the Lego sets. Is that what you're building is a product. It's made out of Lego bricks, but what you're selling is the Lego set. And the Lego set is like the predefined thing, is what you think is great, but your customer can actually take a part of the brick and move it a bit around and then customize it. They can change it a little. It's not like this fixed the thing that comes out of the mold. And the whole point is that the product you're building is built with the same bricks. And you just happen to also sell the bricks outside of the back door. So this kind of mindset of like, I am selling pre-composed Lego sets to my customers and they're all powered by the same thing. I think it really starts there when you think about your platform journey. But I like, frankly, like also think that there's a lot of companies that might not want to become a fully fledged platform and having the fully realized version. They just want to have the public API that somebody can call to get like the temperature on the car or start the car, something like that. Because the car's actually composed of something vastly different, right? So it really depends on like what is that kind of core product that you're building. But if you're truly building like a Bill Gates kind of platform, like you want to enable as much compounded economic value, and that happens by you providing great primitives that can enable internal people and external people to be built on top of you.
Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show. What do you think, how is this latest wave of artificial intelligence going to change developer experience for you?
I think like at a very high level, like my thesis and my mental model is that I do think we are moving into a world where 80% of all code in one way or another will be written by an LLM or an agent. That's really like I think my foundational thesis. And I think we'll be looking back at the dark ages of handwritten code. It's like these programmers where they crafting code by hands without any assistance. What were they thinking, right? Similar way that you go to like the hipster coffee shop and they're making the coffee. That's going to be a space for artisanal kind of crafted experiences. But the vast majority of software is probably going to be more industrialized and produced by machines and LLMs, similar to how we think about like the factory worker. So I think that there's a lot of very interesting like second and third order effects. So what does it mean in a world to provide great developer experience when the main customer is actually no longer the developer, but the tools that the developer is using? So what does it mean to be providing like almost like a AI first or AI native developer experience where you're actually optimizing the interfaces and the abstractions towards the LLM or the agent that is going to interface with the system and not necessarily the human, because the developer might be transitioning to more of like the classic hovering art director meme role where they are like orchestrating different LLMs and tools, kind of be producing stuff. So they're no longer the direct consumer of your API or whatever future abstractions that we have. I think that's going to be like a lot of change in how we think about developer experience. But I should also say that I think this experience is going to be very gradual. I don't think code is going away. I rather think that we're going to have much more code in the world that is now going to be drafted or written by LLMs and agents. And there's still going to be a heck of a lot of systems out there. But we're moving to a world where in a few years, there's probably an inherent like code bases and stacks that has mainly been written by an LLM. And we need to start to reason about that.
And since you mentioned that this is going to be a little bit of a gradual, let's create a scenario where maybe you have a niece or a nephew who's like getting out of high school, going to college, and the college curriculums are going to take a little bit of while to get updated. Maybe you tried talking them out of college, but they want the experience and they want to learn computer science. What's the advice to set them up best for that AI enabled world, being a computer scientist or software engineer?
I think maybe I should start by like a few observations that I'm kind of seeing that is happening in the industry. I definitely think there's an element of like you writing perfect syntax is kind of a skill that is going to zero, in the sense that it's like you don't have to be great at writing perfect Python or .NET or C#. And LLM is probably going to write that for you in the future. Is that you're going to declare your intent, and then you're going to have an LLM drafting the code for you. There's also an element of like, what does that mean? It means that things like domain expertise, you really knowing about a specific vertical, you knowing how about system architecture, how you actually translate requirements from humans and understanding the intent. That's probably going to be much more valuable than you just being a human compiler that can compile whatever this is to a syntax, because the LLMs are probably going to do that, right? I also think like there's an element of like if you are in school today, you doing your core computer science, I think having that strong foundation, understanding systems and how they work is going to be critically important. You can reason about these new systems, but there's also an element of just embracing these tools of like, if you're starting to program today, like use Copilot, like that can really help you to become like the famous 10x or 100x developer, because suddenly you can express your intent and have the system kind of help you. So there's definitely an element of just embracing this new reality of like the task of you writing syntax and understanding different systems is that the LMs can probably do that for you. So I really think about like you enabling your domain knowledge and really you learning to understand like the requirements are probably going to be much more important than the act of writing the code.
Totally. And this answer is probably going to change if I asked it to you next week. But
absolutely.
more recently, what do you think is a tool or a startup out there that you got to use recently that's really leveraging LLMs in a novel way that maybe surprised you?
I think like when it comes to developer tools, the tangible example that comes to life is actually GitHub Copilot. I think it is such a big productivity gain for developers that if you're not using GitHub Copilot today to write your code, you're really missing out. And what I'm seeing is that like we're really seeing developers become so much more productive because they can actually have like full code bases, a lot of part of their business logic really scaffolded for them. And just extrapolating from that, I think we've all seen like the early like edges of what like a more agentic kind of like development workflow looks like. I think there's the famous Devin that went viral, having like an agent where you can give Devin a task and then Devin goes off and build your app for you. I think like in the same realm, we're kind of seeing like GitHub, they just showed like the workspace product where you give it your intent and they will work out a plan and start crafting for you. I definitely think that whole aspect is incredibly exciting of like what it actually means to have like these agents doing work on your behalf. But I also think that there's a lot more like tangible kind of LLM examples like socket.dev, that is a security tool that is using LLMs to kind of analyze your dependencies and do a lot of the security work for you. There's another company out there that I should say I'm also an investor, so I'm really talking my book here, is a company called Dosu, dosu.dev, that is really DOSY.dev, that is really providing, I would say, developer support as a service. So it's an agent you install on your GitHub repository, and every time a developer have an issue, Dosu kind of kicks in and start providing developer support, really fine-tuned to the code base and the community, etc. And they're used by thousands of different repositories and communities today, and really providing developer support at scale. So I think we are starting to kind of see different parts of like the ecosystem now is getting automated by these LLM powered tools, and really enabling like product builders and other people to kind of like have a lot more time. And I think like we also see an explosion among like customer support tools, right? I think every customer support tool in the world are pivoting towards AI because it's a fantastic use case that you can actually have an agent providing developer support, support in general. But I think there's a fine balance there. We've all been a consumer of a chatbot and know how annoying it is to talk to like a chatbot, but we're definitely seeing a lot of value being created.
I mean, on the flip side, I think it was Klarna,
right? Yeah, exactly.
Said that the customers actually preferred it, which we've also talked to a human on the other side of it who doesn't seem to know the same as the person that we talked to last week, and that kind of variance gets stripped down a lot when you're going off of a model compared to having to rely on people showing up to work and being trained the same, right?
So indeed, like this is like now we have like these virtual employees and these virtual agents that actually like just listen to all the onboarding material and can actually provide like the right answers. I think that's going to be a lot of very interesting kind of like verticals. Like I know like we're seeing legal, accounting, etc. Is that I'm definitely seeing a lot of like tools being used, starting to be adopted by law firms where they kind of have like a paralegal as a service. So I think that can look up cases, do casework, find references, etc., which I think is incredibly really exciting. And same for accounting. it's like accounting in the simplest sense is looking at numbers. That turns out systems are really good at that. So I definitely think that there's a lot of these kind of new kind of like levels of productivity that are being enabled that are super, super exciting. But that's also just like tying it back to like the handcrafted code. I definitely think that there's a lot of software developers in the world that probably didn't anticipate them being first in line to kind of get some of their work automated. So I definitely think this is going to be a very interesting transition, because there's probably a lot of software engineers in the world that are very content of being, if I could say, like a human compiler, is that I will take whatever and I'll convert it to code. Where like the job going forward is probably going to be much more human centric. It's probably going to be you working with your customers because the act of actually writing the code is going to be much, much faster. So it's going to free up a lot of creativity and also a lot of your time to kind of do other things. And I think this is actually it's probably going to having a lot of interesting kind of like second order effects of how we think about modern software engineering teams. That do we need as many PMs if the EM or the IC engineer can actually talk to customers directly? And there's a lot of these things, these skills, I think that is going to like be blurred a little, where maybe a PM can actually use a Devon of the world to update the marketing side and scaffold a new feature. So I think it's going to be a very interesting kind of rewiring of product teams in the next 5-ish years.
That's amazing. I love it. And also I think you kind of preemptively answered my next question, which was going back to that niece or nephew and what's going to change. But I was also going to ask you, hey, but also what do you think is going to stay the same? And the need to talk to customers is one that comes up. Anything else that comes to mind that you'd give advice in terms of, hey, this is probably not going to change even with AI? So.
I think that's the element of like craftsmanship and taste, is that you need to have a strong opinion on what you're building. And some of the best products that we're all consuming are some of the best brands in the world because they have a strong point of view. And really, like, people are attracted to taste. People are attracted to craftsmanship and attention to detail. And I think none of these AI tools is going to apply that point of view. It can help you probably build a lot of the things. And when it comes down to like the polish and the point of view, why we're doing this, that's really like human centric. So I still think like that's going to be incredibly important to have that kind of perspective on what you're building, and really just applying that like element of craftsmanship while we are now getting like machines to help us like fine tune and polish the wood a bit better, right?
Maybe even more important than before, if we're normalizing the level of effort that goes into just kind of showing up in the first place, that the opinionation and where you want to plant your flag and the craft is going to be even more of a differentiator.
100%. And like that's an aspect we haven't really talked about, but I think there's going to be a whole new world of software that is going to exist because cost of syntax is kind of going to zero. So I think we actually going to see a lot more, I would say, like specialized or bespoke software that is probably going to be very generic in its expression. But that's all like the tools that used to be like spreadsheets. They're probably going to now be LLM generated apps that people are going to use, mainly internal tools and etc. But it basically means that it's all going to kind of look the same, etc. So how do you stand out in that kind of world where I can literally use a GPT-6 or whatever the future brings to generate a tool? How do you stand out in that kind of world and I think craftsmanship and a strong point of view is going to be a key differentiator.
Awesome. Well, hey, last question that I like to ask all the guests, and this doesn't have to be specific to developer experience, maybe zoom out. What is a product or a service that you got to experience recently that gave you that surprise and delight that you really loved?
And like, this is not recently, but I'm like a very big, like, sucker for like craftsmanship, etc. So that's definitely like mainly like German brands like Leica. When you use a Leica camera, whether it's an analog film camera or digital body, it's just like the whole experience and the attention to detail. Using a Leica camera was like the first kind of camera I used where I really fell in love with taking photos, and I've been a Leica guy ever since. The tech example I always use is really like an Apple TV, in the sense that you buy an Apple TV, you plug it in, and you can configure it on your phone. The moment you need to enter something on the text to log in your favorite TV app, the keyboard actually pops up on your phone, so you can like enter it instead of sitting with your remote. It will calibrate the colors using your phone. The integration really just shows a level of rigor and attention to detail, because the people who have been building the Apple TV has actually been through the experience. No one wants to sit and type a password over the remote, etc. So they've enabled those surprisingly great moments in the product experience. But in general, I would say like probably Leica is a company that stands out. It's like they have literally not changed their core product since the 40s. It's still the same rangefinder product, and they've just been honing on that level of craftsmanship, but also they really embrace like the mindset of like evolution instead of revolution. And I think some of like the most cherished brands in the world is really sticking to the slow evolution over time, that they're refining their products instead of launching a new shiny thing every 30 years.
I love it. I love it. And their digital products are also just super beautiful. Hey, so thank you so much for your time. If people want to contact you, read more of your stuff, where are the best places for folks to find you?
For sure. First of all, thank you for having me. This was fun. Like, I'm glad we could like geek out on various aspects. You can find me on Twitter with my very German last name, Auchenberg. You can also find me on kenneth.io. That's my website where I share a few blog posts, etc. Those are the main two channels where you can tag along if you want to hear me talk about like developer experience and platform building in ecosystem.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
I've gotten to listen to that episode with Kenneth a few times, and I found so many insightful nuggets from that recording. A couple of things that I tend to think about the most are his idea around platforms and citing Bill Gates' definition there, as well as his concept of abstraction ladders. So in the episode, Kenneth talks about a Bill Gates definition. We've put it in the show notes from a Ben Thompson article that cites a Chamath interview with Simil Shah. And as the story goes, when Facebook was fundraising at the time and Bill Gates and Windows were famously involved, as Bill Gates understood the idea about the platform even more, or as Facebook called it, he kind of denounced or disagreed with Facebook being a platform. And he said, this isn't a platform. A platform is when the economic value of everybody that uses it exceeds the value of the company that creates it. Then it's a platform. In Kenneth's disambiguation between you're maybe an infrastructure company that's calling yourself a platform company, and that's based on ecosystem, or in this article differentiates between aggregators and platforms. I think it's something really interesting to think about as we're making trade-offs in our roadmaps and our investments as we're defining our business or our product or even our platform, as to where that economic value is being created. And there's pros and cons to all of it, of course, and trade-offs to consider in terms of which one really fits into your strategy versus being seduced into wanting to being called a platform because it seems like it's the most valuable definition to have. Another one that I think falls a little bit more into the operations of your team is the concept of abstraction ladders. I've gotten the chance to use the Stripe platform. And if you were to use Stripe for payments, depending on the size of your business or how much you're willing to invest in it, a platform can be, and depending on the size of your business or how much you're willing to invest in it, Stripe allows you to customize taking money or taking payments as much as you'd like. You can get an off-the-shelf payments page that you can redirect to where payments can be processed. They won't necessarily be aligned with your branding or colors or style guide or anything. But Stripe, of course, allows you to get in there and get layers deeper in that ladder. Of course, you're taking on more sophistication or complexity, but you're getting the value of more customizability. All the way down to the literal buttons on that page can be modified and how rounded the edges are or what shapes you'd like them. to be similar to how those shapes are in the other parts of your experience. So there isn't an interrupt. Of course, that costs a lot more and requires a fair amount more of effort to get customized. Whereas if you're in the early stages, you want to test something out, or you just want to take payments, then maybe it doesn't matter as much. And what's interesting there in the abstraction ladder, or the discipline that I think Kenneth talks about that's really important in driving, is that the folks who build the kind of less sophistication or more out-of-the-box versions use the same components that your users get to use if they were to go further down that ladder and opt for more customizability alongside the trade-offs. And a metaphor that comes to mind is if you're a bakery that sells bread and also sells really delicious sandwiches, you want to make sure that the bread that your sandwich makers use are available to your customers too. And it's not like the sandwich makers get some special better quality of bread so that your sandwiches are better, but you're not providing access to that to your customers to go out and build their own sandwiches, but with that really high grade, high quality bread that meets the standards of your own sandwich makers in-house at that bakery. And if there's an interrupt in there, that might be a really good pause for consideration. Now, it's really easy, and I've seen it, and I've been guilty of this myself, for this to happen, where sometimes you need to get something out really fast. Sometimes, maybe in this metaphor, packaging this higher quality version of bread or pricing it and getting it out to customer readiness has some additional layers of complexity or delay that, as a sandwich maker, I don't really care about. And I just want to get sandwiches out, and causes an interrupt within your organization. And if you don't have that discipline, I think that's a very risky form of technical debt that can creep in, wherein your customers no longer have access to the same APIs that your internal tools teams do, or your internal teams do, and therefore create a more compromised developer experience for your customers than for your internal teams. And it's not easy to do, certainly. As I've mentioned, I've slipped into allowing for this to happen on my own teams or teams that I run, and requires for that little pushes and prods and clarifying the vision of wanting to create this really beautiful developer experience to your developers that, of course, needs to be reinforced, as your teams tend to have a lot of different priorities, a lot of different things coming at them. And that reinforcements and repetition and leading by example is oftentimes a way that you can maintain that. So hope you enjoyed the episode. I definitely learned a lot from Kenneth, and let me know what you think about either of these concepts around platform or abstraction ladders too. It's something that I'm going to be thinking about more and wanting to nerd out about. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence Podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.